Hello and welcome to the Humble Brag Podcast. I'm your host, Nate Mandel, and I'm joined today by my brother, Yudi. Thanks for joining again.
Absolutely.
This is part 2 of our mini-series on Zionism, more specifically the history of Zionism. So we're doing this 4-part series. Part 1 was the history of the development of Zionism. This is part 2, and it's on religious Zionism. Part 3, again, is going to be secular Zionism. And finally, part 4 will be political Zionism, which kind of refers to the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We ended part 1, right? We were working the timeline. It's all about the timeline, right? Because we were working through the history. So we ended about at the year 1900. So if anyone listening is really interested in the topic, it's important to listen to part 1 because it's important to understand how we got to where we are. So if we ended at about 1900, you could basically just continue from where we left off. And obviously, again, the focus is going to be on religious Zionism. So I don't know exactly what we were talking about when we finished last time, but whatever it is, it was about the year 1900.
So what I'm actually going to do is take us back now, because we got to back up prior to Herzl. Herzl, as we said last time, wrote his book in 1896, which exploded the whole Zionist movement. But he's not the first to talk about a political movement of Zionism. And there were actually rabbinic figures earlier on who did. And probably the most seminal, he's called the first seer, HaChozeh HaRishon. That's what they referred to him to. His name was Yehuda Alkalai, well known for people that are on this topic. And he was born 1798, and there were various things that happened in his life. He was born in Sarajevo, in Bosnia, and he's the first one to really point to Zionism, the return of the Jews to the land of Israel as a nation, and not just like Chovevei Tzion, who we mentioned last time, or the students of the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, who went to Israel to start Ishuvim and start living in Israel again. He wrote down in 1840s early on that number one, it needs to be through the powers of the time, the Ottomans, the kings, Britain, France. So now he's looking at it on a global scale, that this return to Israel of the Jewish people has to come about through, he's not writing that we could have to continue to daven and pray to God and this messianic movement is going to happen, because that was the Weltanschauung of Judaism all the years. So even if Yehuda Levi is writing about his love for Israel and Ramban moves to Israel, like we spoke last time, and you had Yehuda Chassid later with a Churvan, here's a rabbi, a big rabbi, who's saying that we have to make it practical now.
Less of that, waiting for the magic, but less of the magic ideology.
That we've spoken about, the magic, right. The abstract idea, right, of the land belonging to the Jews, and something's going to happen
more realistic
that'll end exile, end this sojourn that we have in Gullus. So the whole concept of redemption, Geula, what does that mean? So it meant something for all the years along those lines of a magical thing happening. He's the first one to put it down on paper that we got to do something ourselves. And he said that influential Jews should talk to people, talk to kings, talk to ministers to get this thing moving in a political way. So he's the first to really do that. What influenced him? What was the change? In his book, he mentions a lot Ruach HaZman, the winds of the time. So if you're thinking 1840, 1850, it's after emancipation, the Napoleonic Wars, American Revolution happened in 1776. So there's a whole new, right? All these ideas of countries working towards their independence and freedom. So he keeps mentioning that concept of the Ruach HaZman demands of us to do the same type of thing for self-determination, for groups. Even in his own country, in Serbia, there was that bid for freedom of self-determination for the Serbians. So he's probably operating off of that. Another thing that pushed him towards that, in 1840, there was it's called the Damascus Affair, where Jews were accused. There was a blood libel in Damascus, and they arrested a bunch of Jews. Some were killed, many were tortured. It was a bad deal. And Moses Montefiore was involved in trying to help the Jews. And that really showed him, just like the Dreyfus Affair is going to point out to Herzl later, that there's no other choice but to be alone, have our own country, to self-determine. This pointed out to Rav Alkalai a very similar thing, that these stuff won't go away. Blood libels. It's like, the world's moving forward. There's freedom. There's the Industrial Revolution started. And still you're killing Jews for you're killing a child to put the blood in the matzah. It's such an archaic, backwards thing. He says it doesn't make sense. So this is pushing him towards seeing that we have to do something about it. It has to come from us. And another interesting point is that in Belgrade, where he later became the chief rabbi, Herzl's grandfather davened in a shul and knew him. So these ideas trickle down that he hears from his rabbi to Herzl later on. No question about it. No question about it. So that's that link in that regard. But you're seeing from here a rabbinic position on. So Herzl didn't come up with the idea that there has to be, that you have to work with the nations of the lands, the nations of the world, in order to facilitate the Jews returning and taking over the country and reclaiming Israel as its own. He lays it out in his Sefer. This is much earlier than Herzl. And I think it's worth exploring also this idea of what redemption meant for so many years for Jews, what being in exile means, and what redemption means on the other hand, as a polar opposite. You have someone like the Maharal, who died in 1610 or 1609, big seminal, huge figure in the Jewish world, wrote many books. He had an idea that exile demands redemption, just by the fact, because we're thinking of it almost as two separate things. Because you're in exile, we're going to wait for Geula, for this thing to happen that's going to help us, that's going to save us. He's tying them together. They're one. Being in exile, being in the diaspora outside of Israel, means that it's a hard concept. I don't know if we're going to take this out, because he goes on for chapters on this.
Well, I'm thinking about it. I'm trying to.
I would have to work on that more. It was a brilliant
explain
way.
that differentiation. I don't really see it right off the bat. I do find it interesting that it took so many years to come to the realization that we have to get practical about it, though. I mean, it's so many. We're talking. This just happened in less than 200 years ago.
So it shows you how
a little bit more, but
it shows you how hard the PTSD.
How did we go so many hundreds of years,
literally,
without coming to
1,700 years, and no one ever thought or even dreamt that that we can do that. That we would have enough power to even appeal to the empires of the world to allow us to return and reclaim the land.
So, obviously, it could be a timing thing. A lot of things throughout history are timing things, and you spoke about the idea of the wind, right? The
wind of time.
The wind of time. Those concepts are very, very prevalent, and you see them pretty clearly. Like it could just be like a ruach, like a breath of some kind of energy that's sweeping through the world. And okay, so like that makes sense. Because to think that it went so many years without anyone coming up or really trying hard on that route is really interesting.
Yeah. So he was definitely the first and the most influential in the religious circles to push that idea forward. And of course, Rav Kook took it way further, and he was born in 1865 in Eastern Europe. He was called an Ilui. He was a genius in Talmudic studies and rabbinical studies. He went to Volozhin and other big Torah academies, and the times too, because you're seeing it's about, there's so much change happening because of the Industrial Revolution and modernization. I mean, we're looking back now, like they weren't modern, but for the times, it was so much change happening where sons are changing from their fathers. That was what was going on then. Not listening to not following along in their father's footsteps with socialism and many other revolutionary ideas. And they knew how to tap into that and say, we need to do the same thing.
Interesting. It's almost pretty intellectual,
clearly,
to do that and to tap into that. So it's a time thing. It's an era timing thing.
Definitely. So then the Mizrahi movement is born later on, maybe 1900 or 1902, which had a group of rabbis that were on board with this movement. But again, there's still that struggle because the people that are facilitating this new movement, Zionism, are mostly secular. How do you get on board with non-religious Jews, people that are anti-religiosity for the most part, who are the ones going to King Chaim Weizmann's not a religious man. He has power. He goes to the British. He's might have been the one that convinced Balfour to make his declaration to allow for the state of Israel. So how do you get on board with that if you're so steeped in the religious world where you look down, you look negatively on secular Jews, but they're the ones that can do it. They're the ones that are doing it. Herzl lights this fire, and he got so many people on board, and now you have religious Jews who kind of want to go along. They want to do this, but how do you go hand in hand with people that you look at as evildoers and
kind of the same struggle we still have today. That particular struggle didn't really go anywhere. It's still
So what's very unique about Rav Kook is his background is a Litvish background, Lita, which is, they were not on board with the Hasidic movement and all that. Hasidic movement being a reformer movement in Judaism that the Jews of Lita, led by the Gra, the Vilna Gaon that we mentioned last time, were against. They were called Misnagdim. The anti, the forget the exact terminology of mitnaged. They were against the Hasidic movement, but he had a unique position because from his mother's side, he comes from the Tzemach Tzedek of Lubavitch. He was into Kabbalah. He was into all the Kabbalistic, but he spoke in modern Hebrew even when he was in
Rav Kook.
Rav Kook. So he's growing up in this very frum world, and he's a huge. The head on the man in Talmudic studies was incomparable. But his love, what he felt in regards to Israel, and the need for us to continue on this political path towards establishing a state, it was a drive. He spoke modern Hebrew while he was in yeshiva, and he would continue to. When he came to Israel, he felt the need to speak while he was in yeshiva, the vernacular is Yiddish, but he took it practically. So his balance that he had with Kabbalistic thought, Hasidic teachings of Kabbalah, practical Kabbalah, and his Litvish Misnagdic background in learning and style and all that stuff set him up that the way he saw religious people versus secular people is very different than everyone else. He sees it as a spectrum of how close you are to God and how far you are from God. But he sees everyone as the same.
Mm-hmm.
You're more religious, so you're more connected to God. You're closer to Elikus. You're closer to God. But you're the same as another Jew over there. He's just further down the scale. When you look at it in that light, you can embrace everyone. And he embraced everyone. But that's a new idea to everyone else in the religious world it was very hard for people to accept. Constant conflict with the rabbis around him because he was so accepting, and he felt that they have a mission to serve in regards to this, return to Israel and reclaim the land and build it up again. So he loved them. And he would travel out there to kibbutzim and meet these secular people and spend time with them. He would do like tours of Israel.
So that is essentially where religious Zionism was born.
Yes. On a strong level, because there was earlier the Netziv also, who was the Rosh Hashiva of Volozhin. He was his Rosh Hashiva. He also has writings in regards to Israel, but he couldn't take the political, he couldn't take the infighting and the not getting along, so he kind of like backed away from it. His son, Meir Bar Ilan, who changed his name from Berlin to Bar Ilan, Bar Ilan University today, very famous, he established a movement called Mizrahi, which is on the word Mizrach, which is East Israel. He called it Mizrahi, I think 1902. And that was the religious affiliation of Zionism. They're going to go along with it. They had a seat at the conventions of Herzl started the Zionist Congress. Every year they would get together, all the leaders, and there were rabbis of the Mizrahi. They were a party. It exists till today. There's a party called the Mizrahi. But from the more right wing, and again, the Mizrahi had this struggle, but Rav Kook was able to dissect it and lead it. And I'm not sure how he identified with the Mizrahi movement so much, even though he's their spiritual leader, because he also there's that, they want to like stay away from embracing too much of the secular Jews, but he was all in for them. He felt they had a role to play in bringing Jews to Israel and setting up the land that the frum Jews were simply not capable of doing. And he was a powerful enough figure that it lasted, that it's strong. I mean, you have Dati Leumi, of religious Jews who are Leumi. They're nationalist religious Jews. It's probably, I think there's almost 1 million or 1 million of them today in Israel that are Talmidim from Talmidim of Rav Kook and his son Tzvi Yehuda. So it was big enough to last. It was strong. He was strong enough to push it through till today. But that's the religious Zionist circle that was born, you could say, with Rav Yehuda Al-Kalai and also Rav Bivas, who Rav Al-Kalai met also. He was this character rabbi born in Gibraltar, had a couple of posts, but his concept of tshuva, of returning, he felt that the Jews did everything they can do. You think of the concept of tshuva, time of Mordechai and Esther and Purim. She says, take all the Jews in, they should fast for 3 days. He writes, we don't have strength to fast. We don't have the strength or the capabilities to do all the things that we think of typical tshuva. He says, now tshuva means we're going to Israel and God has to accept that as our return.
The final hoorah.
Everyone has to go and be there and God has to accept it. Because the whole idea of, we were talking a little bit before about the redemption. What is redemption? What's going to happen, right? We discussed all that. Is Zionism messianism? What's this final redemption going to look like? Is it about Mashiach, a Messiah coming and rescuing the Jews? Or does it just beg, as the Maral said, it was a little hard for me to put into words, but because exile exists, Geula has to exist too. It's something that we have to come in and take. Because you're in this situation, get yourself out of this situation by doing something about it. Or do you sit and wait for this magical, so you see 100 years, it's permeating, it's coming into Jewish literature and Jewish writing more and more, that it's we have, when the Gra, the Vilna Gaon that we talked about last time, he sends a bunch of his Talmidim to Israel because he felt, again, he's the one that wrote that there has to be 600,000 Jews in Israel for the Geula to begin, for it to happen. And that's exactly how many were there in 1948.
Yeah.
He's not talking about it the same way Rav Alkalai is talking about it. He's still on the magical part of it.
I think traditionally, ingathering of the exiles was just one of the parts of the Messianic era, but not the actual redemption itself, because there's the Messiah part.
It's the beginning. That's what's going to bring everyone together. So the whole, I think it was a struggle with Jews for 1800 years, and many till today, with religious Jews. Because up until the emancipation, basically most of the Jews were religious. What changed was, and what Rav Alkalai is talking about, is the Ruach HaZman, is the winds of time, because there's so much, now it's not just a bunch of Jews in ghettos and shtetls who aren't capable of interacting. There's lawyers, there's doctors, there's officials, there's treasurers, there's people in real positions of power that can affect change that didn't exist prior. Go back 100 years before, it's all shtetl Jews.
Now I think we see it pretty clearly, even though obviously some Jews still need to be enlightened on the topic, but we see it pretty clearly. We're talking about how it came into sight to begin with, and that's interesting.
As it develops, as the times develop, suddenly thought is changing. That no, you can't just sit around and wait. We've been sitting around and waiting, nothing happened. The Arizal and the Beis Yosef, who these are Jews that, based on the Kabbalistic writings, understood the importance of Eretz Yisrael to Jews. They themselves went. The Ramban picked himself up and went to Israel. Yehuda Levi went to Israel.
But they didn't have the oomph to involve a
collective of everyone together going there, and no one had it. And even the Jewish groups in the mid-1800s, Chovevei Tzion, all they can do is send a few people, open a yishuv, start a little moshav, and work the land agriculturally to fulfill a mitzvah. Again, to fulfill a mitzvah of working the land. But that's not going to give you a country. That's not going to give you autonomy. The people that could put that into effect were the secular Jews in positions of power. And that's exactly what happened. So you can say, the seed's born, like we talked about, the seed for the yearning. You go back to Yehuda Levi, or even to davening every day. But so that, hundreds of years, that seed continues. They're singing songs and poetry about Israel and going to Israel and one. But now Rav Alkalai sets a new seed into motion of us practically using the empires and the powers in the world to really set us up to have the capabilities of coming back to this land, reclaiming it, having Hebrew as a language, which Herzl put into his book, that nobody thought possible. An ancient language never comes back, never happened, ever. It never happens that a nation comes back to its homeland from 2,000 years. It never happened. Never happened. It only happened with the Jews. And 7 million Jews in Israel today, and they're speaking Hebrew, the original language.
Yeah, really fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's the birth of religious Zionism. So how do we take that further down the timeline?
The way you take it further down the timeline is by looking at more current. So first you have the yeshiva of Rav Kook. So they continued on their way of teaching his teachings, and the whole settlement movement in Israel. Now we're getting into more current. After the 6-Day War, so much more land was captured. And then they start setting up who's going to go live in these settlements, who's going to go out there and really settle the land. Stuff they believe in are these people that are Talmidim, students of Rav Kook's yeshivas and their teachings. And that's who lives out in all these places. The whole Gush Katif area, it's all religious people. So they're going to take what they were learning and taught and go practically and settle those dangerous places, living in a little barbed wire town. So that's how that stream goes along till today. But if you want to go away from the Mizrahi or the national religious to the more right wing, every once in a while, a little bit of a revolution would happen for certain unique people. One of them is, his name was Yisachar Shlomo Teichtal, who was a Hungarian rabbi. During the war, he leaves his village. He ends up being stuck in Budapest for a while, which is the capital city in Hungary. He's a student of the Munkacs Rebbe, who's a big, fiery, extremist, anti-Zionist rabbi. Because you have to remember, even though there were some, Rav Kook and a few other rabbis, who prior to World War II were openly pro-Zionist, pro-secular Jews, all that's the vast majority of the right wing from Jews still didn't. They were not on board. They couldn't accept that. But now, when he's observing what's going on, a few years into the war, the destruction of European Jewry happening, because Hungary wasn't pulled into the war until late in the war, until 1944. They were able to kind of stay out of it. Even though they were under a tyrannical regime, they weren't under Nazi rule. Until 1944, the Nazis invaded and killed 1 million Jews in that 1 year. They sent them out, Auschwitz, ghettos, and all this. And he ended up dying. But he wrote a book before he died called Eim Abanim Samecha. The mother of the children is happy. And the mother, obviously, he's referring to the land of Israel. And he wrote a book, it's a long essay, on the mistakes, the folly of not having gone to Israel earlier. He became a big Zionist. He's a full-on Hasidic rabbi, completely changed his mind, completely changed how he saw the world and how he saw the Jewish people and the self-determination that he believed that the Jews should have had. And he writes an entire book on it, and they printed it. So it was printed during the war. He ends up dying, but it got out there, and it's been printed and reprinted. And it's a handbook that religious Jews use constantly for reference to the validity of the entire Zionist movement. It's an excellent, excellent book. So that's one. So that gives a lot of energy to religious Jews who hear a lot of the negativity and the propaganda against Zionism, afraid, are you a Zionist? Ooh, no, I'm not I can't be. What are you, a Zionist? So it's the connotation, right? If you're not Mizrahi or you're not a national religious who are proud Zionists because of Rav Kook's teaching, for a typical right-wing Jew from Jew, you don't associate yourself with Zionism. Agudas Yisrael, who the Haredi world, the religious from world, associates, that's their party. We're talking about how parties are coming and going in those early years, early 1900s. There's a socialist party and the Bund party and the Mizrahi, and everyone's making groups and you're part of a group. This was going on in Eastern Europe, Russian movements, all kind of movements happening, and everybody wants to be part of a group. They started Agudas Yisrael, it's called, also to have a group for the religious Jews. Chafetz Chaim was involved and other big rabbis, and they had conventions, and until today, there's Agudas Yisrael is still a party today. They're officially non-Zionist till today. They don't want to get on board. They don't want to be on board with Zionism. So he writes a book like this, it's a scholarly work where he goes through every facet of the entire Torah, Midrashim, Talmudic, anecdotes, stories, Tanakh, all by heart, because he was a refugee in Budapest. He's sitting in a room waiting out the war and writing all of this by heart. An entire book showing the validity and the mistake of not being on board fully. And not only, and again, like Rav Kook, fully embracing the secular Jews who did go to Israel and are building the land.
So that's a biggie. So if we look at the entire religious spectrum right now even, and we want to understand of the religious who are Zionists, meaning they do believe in taking the land and having the land and all that stuff, which is only a section, obviously, because there's a huge portion of religious Jews who don't. right? But of the ones that do, so everybody fits, basically comes down from Rav Kook and the couple that we explained, or is there still, or does it come from more places?
So I do think there are a few more people without the influence of big rabbis, like without the influence, like this rabbi Teichtel didn't have the influence Rav Kook had. So if I like his book, I'm not a student of his, I'm not a follower of his, I'm not a chassid of his.
So those are the big big
like
influencers.
There were more. There was another book written after the 6-Day War. So now you're getting into the state of Israel already established. Its tenuous first 20 years of its existence. They held off the Arab armies in 1948, but Israel's kind of cut in half. They don't have the whole West Bank. They don't have Gaza, right? It's still shaky a little bit, but then the 6-Day War comes and they just take it all back. In 6 days, conquered the entire Sinai Desert, the whole West Bank, the Golan Heights, Gaza. Huge victory. So now, if, put yourself in the place, you're a religious Jew. Right wing, Agudas Yisrael, from Jew, a Chassid or a Litvak, or what do you do with that? Again, the feelings, Messianic era, look at these victories, it's unbelievable. But you're afraid to think in an exuberant way about these victories being a prelude, as it was called, a Schalta de Geula. This solidifies what happened 20 years before.
Yeah, and heaven forbid, classify yourself as a Zionist.
You're afraid. So the Rosh Yeshiva of the Ger Yeshiva in Yerushalayim, his name was Menachem Mendel Kasher. Great rabbi. He was from Poland, already a big genius in Poland before the war. Comes to Israel afterwards. The Ger Rebbe at the time, I believe it was Imre Emes, who also had Zionistic feelings, very strong. He might have been a bigger threat to Satmar than this type of book, like Teichtel, because he was a Rebbe with followers. Big Ger was huge. Today they're huge. They were big then. So it's a threat to the anti-Zionist by having a mainstream Hasidic rabbi who's pro-Israel and pro-Zionism, but he never really came out with any type of path in regards to that. So he taps this man, Menachem Mendel Kasher, to be the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva Sfas Emes. So you're seeing a man who's taken in to be Rosh Yeshiva. He's obviously full Haredi mode of thought. After the 6-Day War, he writes a book called Hatkufa Hagdola, the Great Era. And he goes on, and it's a big fat book, scholarly work as well, also hammering home that this is it. He's using all the language of Rav Kook. Rav Kook called it Reishis Tzmichas Geula Seinu, which is put into the Misha Berach, that this is the beginning, the seed of our redemption. And he writes about this era being that era. And it's an excellent book. And he goes through all the same proofs from antiquity, from Tanakh, and from the Gemaras and Midrashim and all. He's a scholar, and he writes this amazing book. But what does that book do? The same thing Eim Abanim Samecha does for those who find them and like it and read it. But what influence does it have on the rest of Haredi society? Not much. They're going to still go along with the mainstream, the rabbinic view of the right wing, Agudas Yisrael, just not fully on board with this idea that's unfolding in front of us.
It's like we're dragging them, and they're kicking and screaming and
holding on to something.
And they're still holding on now.
Still holding on.
It's like how far do we have to drag until you give in or you see the light yourself? But the right wing.
And what light? What are people expecting to see?
The wind that we discussed.
Ruach Hazman.
That's what you want them to. You want them to acknowledge and have that realization that it's not going to come about maybe in the ways that they thought it might, and
that's hard to accept.
And this is the time. And
what we said last time also on the other podcast about certain people feeling those things, that Ruach Hazman. You can see Rav Kook felt it, and finally Teichtel, right before he dies, he finally got it, And Rav Kasher, he finally he got it after the 6-day. That happened to tip him over to seeing, but some don't still don't see it. You say they don't want to see it,
Well,
willfully blind, or afraid to let go of something else that.
Well, it depends. The sheeple, the people who follow the rabbi, a real satmar person who just follows blindly. He doesn't know the history. He doesn't, the typical person doesn't really know. It's we're not talking about knowledge, and they're willfully. No, you're you're a cheerleader. But the leaders probably do know more, and they have their couple arguments that they hold on to. I just feel like they're not blessed to get that energy or to see the light, and a lot of people are, and the people who do see the light and do have that blessing of sight are the ones that innovate or make shit happen.
Clear, yeah, absolutely. Even Herzl understood the importance of having the Mizrahi, this religious party, at the Congress. He wanted their opinion because he knew it needs to come with like a rabbinic stamp of approval of what we're doing. He understood the importance of what he's doing. He did, clearly. But he knew he needs to have rabbis involved. And they were involved, but not enough. Until today, not enough. Even though the National Religious have many rabbis, great rabbis, big thinkers, rabbis that served in the IDF, and they still do miluim every year for 30 days. And these are rabbis with beards and who sit and teach Torah the whole day. But to them, Rav Kook cemented within a segment of Israeli society, and even outside of Israel, he studied, obviously, in other segments of society, this love for Eretz Yisrael, this love for Israel from a religious point of view, and to embrace everyone involved in this project. And that's what he did himself, and that's what his Talmidim do after him. Because if you take an alien from outer space, bring him down, you open up all 5 books of the Torah, you lay it out, tell him to read through the whole thing, ask him, what do you think the message in this book is? It's so simple and clear, from non-stop, from beginning, well, from Avram at least, all the way down, that you're getting a land. You're getting a land. I'm promising your grandchildren. Yitzchak, I'm promising your grandchildren. A bris, covenants, all every day by davening. Everything's about, I took you out of Mitzrayim to bring you to this land. Everything that the Jews went through, the whole midbar, every commandment, every mitzvah, right? We mentioned this the first time. The whole thing, it's linear, straight through, all about the land. When you sin, various stuff, you don't listen to what I say, you don't listen, you're going to lose the land. So the land is tied to everyday behavior, your morality. You lose it, you're going to lose the land. And that's why you see throughout the ages, if having the land and losing the land is predicated upon you behaving well, how about 1,000 years later, if you're in 1090 living in France and the Crusaders come through and kill all the Jews in the town? What's the rabbi going to get up and say? Your sin. Because if the whole exile is based upon umipnei chataenu galinu me'atzenu, that because of our sins we were driven out of our land, this is the exile. Now everything that happens in the exile is tied to sin. It's tied to doing things wrong. Because if you weren't doing things wrong, you wouldn't be here to begin with. You'd be back in your land. So what's keeping everyone alive all these years, this hope and idea, is that something can become corrected to correct the whole situation so that we can go back to our land. We can get it back again. But it's an ideal for 1,700 years. How do you take that ideal and make it practical?
Well, we know now because we
can look back.
Right, because we've seen what happened. But it's a really interesting nuance in ultra right wing thinking that they're still stuck in that. I don't know what it is. Maybe it has something to do with the dream or the magical version of how they think things are going to unfold, right? What does it take for them to come to terms with the notion that maybe it's secular Jews who are going to bring about this very practical, like you said, right? There's this line. It's all about the land. It's all about the goddamn land, and all we need is the land. And maybe it'll be non-frum Jews who are going to get us the land, which we know, it came about the way that it came about, but they can't wrap their heads around that because it's not, I guess, their version or vision of how it's supposed to come about.
Well, think about what I just said. If you lost the land because of sin, how can you be redeemed back to the land, the same land, by sinners? And that could be the hang-up.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So it's from that perspective or that thought, it's basically playing God. You're trying to do God's bidding, God's thinking, and you're failing because
it's still happening,
right? Because you think you know what God's thinking. So
and God's
you're
saying,
failing.
No, I am going to
succeeding.
use them, and He used them, and it happened. So you're still saying no, but it shouldn't happen.
But nobody,
it's not supposed to happen.
Nobody asked you, right?
So you have a question on God, why He did it this way. And somebody asked Rav Tzvi Yehuda Cook once, a rabbi from America came to the yeshiva, and he asked Rav Tzvi, who's the son of Avram Yitzchak. His father was the original Rav Cook, passed away in 1935, and his son became the Rosh Yeshiva, and he expanded much deeper and further than his father. And he raised many, many Talmidim who became rabbis who spread this ideal and message further and further. And this American rabbi asked him this question: How can it be? Ech yachol liyot that the Geula is going to come about through sinners? Yesh lecha sheila al Elokim. You have a question on God. Why are you asking me? That's how it happened. And if you want to do a parallel to the first Geula, which is out of Egypt, Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't accepted. He wasn't part of the clan, of the group. He grew up in the house of Paro. He grows up in Pharaoh's house till he's 40. And there's a verse that says that he went out to see his brothers, Vayetze Alechav, and there's actually a debate amongst the Rishonim, the early medieval rabbis, whether that meant Egyptians or the Jews. If you read it, you're like, okay, he went to see his Jews. Not so certain. There was a little bit of a conflict where he stood. He grew up there. He's raised as a prince. Now think about the last Redeemer, Herzl, who grows up in Austria, completely secular, completely disconnected from Judaism. He's going to be the guy that's going to redeem you. Moshe tells God, they won't believe in me. Vehem lo yaminu bi. So he's telling God, why send Aaron? Aaron's the ghetto rabbi. He's there with the Jews. They know him. He can talk. God says, no, I'm picking you. I want you to do it. I have a hard time speaking. What does a hard time speaking mean? It's also not clear. Maybe he meant that I don't speak Yiddish. I speak Egyptian.
I don't speak their language. Herzl didn't either. He was Austrian. He spoke German, French. Comes this man, and us, and the ultra right community didn't believe in him. Same way it says, they didn't believe in him either. To go along with this flow that ends up 50 years later by having the land back and having our own country back. So there is a very similar parallel from the first redemption to the last redemption. It's an amazing parallel. I mean, very simply, the ultra-right wing could benefit by obviously stopping to think, the way that they think. We were talking about this. And being part of it, being part of the project. Religious Jews should be at the forefront. Right. Well, that's step 2. But first we have to get past the first hurdle. We were just talking about this earlier today. One of the ways they could do that potentially is by looking at the past also more practically, all of the stuff that happened, because we were talking about the Megillah, maybe the story of Purim and all that stuff, right? Because in the Megillah, we hear the way that the story unfold.
Miraculous. It's all.
That's how I always felt growing up hearing it, and really it was just very political, a very basic
political intrigue.
Exactly the way
King,
things happen now.
Wife, queen, the bad advisor.
For some reason, there's just something that they put into us. The way that we conceptualize it is a very magical, fantastical way, and it's not. It's just very political, very, very realistic and practical. If you start looking at stuff like that and realizing that that is really how everything always was. And then you'll stop having a beef with how it is now, because that is how it's always going to be. It could really change everything.
So talking about the Purim story, that was one of the nails that Rav Al-Khalai uses in his point to drive home that we need to go to the political leaders of the world because of the Persian permission that the Jews got after the first temple was destroyed. The Jews got to go back from Bavel. They didn't just pick up and go. Nehemiah goes to Koresh. He goes to the king, the Persian king, and he's telling him and he's begging him and he's so we need to go back. It's our homeland and blah blah blah. And he gave permission for the Jews to go. So he says the same thing. He said, why is it different today? You got to go to the powers that be. That concept of Mashiach, of the Savior, messianic, and all those lofty ideas, and it's all true, but we have to do on our part, and this is what these rabbis felt, because even the hearts and minds of the kings are also in the hands of Hashem.
We're not getting crap if we don't work for it, work hard for it,
and that took 1,700 years to realize that, to make that change. And it came from religious rabbis. It came from rabbis, even though there were very few. There were just a few. Kol Hatar is another sefer that was written, the sound of the trumpet, the sound of the shofar, all these, ideals of, but the seeds came from them. Herzl was able to take it practically and implement. He went to the Sultan. He went to the Ottoman Empire. He went to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, spoke to him. He had people going to, the British. Finally, after World War I, it left the Ottoman hands and fell into British hands because they lost, and then it became easier. But you see how all these steps happen. Under Ottoman rule, they never agreed. The Jews, we're not letting Jews move in there. Suddenly World War I comes along. It's out of their hands now. It's in the British hands. British hands. Chaim Weizmann has a way in, and this Jew knows that one. They had more power in the British Empire. And before you know it, Balfour Declaration. Next step, unfortunately, World War II and the Holocaust had to happen to cement the return to Israel. Because if you could say almost, if not for the Holocaust, you'd still have 6 million Jews living in Europe, and maybe only a few would have come to Israel. It's sad. It's just like a very harsh thing, but that's what happened. You could say it's because it's tznius. You could say it's because they didn't keep Shabbos. It's theory. But what we do know for sure...
Or the Jewish favorite, wasted seed. Blame it on the seeds.
Yeah.
Jews have a seed obsession.
But what we do know what happened is that out of this horrific horror of a tragedy came the rebirth in the land of Israel 3 years later.
So the overview basically on religious Zionism, we have to, you have to understand that there's still this huge divide. So the people who are on...
Till today.
The religious Jews who are Zionists basically come from the couple people that you just described.
Yeah.
They come down from that. And of course, there's also other influences in today's day, right?
Right.
I'm not a Rav Kook Talmud, but I'm a religious Zionist, but it comes through other influences. But that's the big stuff. And then you have the other half, or more than half, I don't know what the proportions are, that are still stuck in that older way of thinking. They can't wrap their head around the fact that it came about the way it came about, and they just won't let go. And, I'm satisfied with this. Look, if this, summarizes part 2, if it summarizes what religious Zionism is, we don't have to get into any of that other type of detail. No problem. But
yeah.
it does seem to be pretty, all-inclusive. It kind of covers what's going on, and it's actually very simple. It's
right.
So basic.
Because there was just a few influencers who shaped a worldview for religious Zionism, changed, went through various people, but there was a stream, and it stands true until today. It didn't change and reform and get a little better, a little different. Is what it is. That there's a project happening here. There's something that's connected to our entire biblical history, and we all have to work towards a goal.
It's interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how it continues to unfold
In the future.
especially for the religious side of things. So, all right. Well, is there anything else? Okay. So what we'll do is we'll leave that at that, and part 3 will be on secular Zionism.
Right.
Because if we take all 4 parts, once it's done, you have the history, the early history, and then the religious perspective and what's going on the religious side of things, and then the secular. And then you put the icing on the cake with the actual political Zionism. There's a much, much more coherent and cohesive understanding of the entire Israel topic.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Peace and love.